We're going to go next to Derek Brocksmith. So Derek has spent the last several years developing the miniature swine program and working with sponsors on the selection of animal models at Sinclair. He's conducted non-clinical research studies focusing on behavior. He works with clients to minimize human and animal stress, developing protocols that are sustainable for working with swine. He worked at Sinclair Research Center as an animal and vet technician prior to serving at Sinclair Bioresources as the general manager. I also will say personally that Derek, in addition to being a great guy, is one of our most popular speakers and is one of the few people I think that he's spoken at more of these conferences than anybody else because his talk is one of everybody's favorites every single year. So we are very happy to have Derek back with us, and we look forward to listening to his talk. Go ahead, Derek.
Thanks, Eric. I'm glad to be back here. I've been honored to be invited to do this for several of these. I think probably 4 or 5. It kind of all runs together now. Can everyone see that?
I don't see your screen yet. There it is.
There we go. So today I just want to go over a little bit of our program. I know in years past we've focused more on social housing, and this year I'm kind of excited to get into kind of the meat and potatoes of our program on what we do to enhance the behavior of the animals. And I feel like I'm a little bit spoiled because not only are we a production facility, but I also get to take these protocols to our CRO side and solve a lot of their problems. So we'll go over a little bit of the history of swine and just give a little bit of background for those that don't know much about how swine were domesticated and how their natural roots correlate to what we know today in the research community. I'll also go over some of our tools that we use to enhance behavior in our production setting, as well as how those correlate and translate into the laboratory. And then things that you can do to refine everyday life and make it fun and exciting for the technicians and the animals. Like Dr. Shapiro said, if your staff isn't having fun enhancing the behavior of all the animals, then it's not going to be as good of an experience. So swine are not native to the American continent. They were brought here in approximately 1539 to the lower 48. It was thought that they were domesticated in China some 10,000 years ago. They weren't only domesticated as a food source, but they were also highly regarded in Chinese culture as just being a part of everyday life and some religious aspects. As recently as 2015, genomic studies have found that swine were actually domesticated twice, once in China and then once again in what we know is today is Turkey. And it's thought that most of Europe was populated from that colony that came from Turkey. And the other domestic swine, even today, can be traced back to the first domestication 10,000 years ago. So pigs have been around a long time. And what we found is that early research that was done in domestic swine was very efficacious and is still very effective today, but the need arose for long-term studies for a smaller large animal model that could still translate to human results. So miniature swine over the years have filled those shoes very well. Most laboratories around the world now have domestic or miniature swine and some domestics depending on the protocols. Most of the laboratory breeds today have a feral background, so that's where they get their smaller stature and their body weight. Miniature swine are smaller at sexual maturity and skeletal maturity than domestic pigs, and they also grow a lot slower, but they still maintain some of those feral characteristics. Depending on the breeds, you'll see that they have a bullet-shaped body. The caudal skull angle is more wide than a domestic pig. They're obviously a lot smaller. The coat coloration is a lot different and not as generalized as domestics. You'll also notice that the males have prominent canines, whereas domestic pigs don't have that. The females in the wild will live in sounders where the males are solitary, and some of that behavior correlates to the laboratory setting as well. And the obstacles we face with social housing when it comes to those intact males. They have very acute hearing and sense of smell, but they have very poor eyesight. And in the wild during the summer, they're usually nocturnal, and then they're diurnal in the winter. We kind of mitigate that obviously with light cycles in production as well as in the research facilities. And something else that's unique to the feral or wild pigs is the development of dermal plates on the males. You don't see this in domestic swine at all. And it's really prominent in the Yucatan strain. And I think you can see that more because they're mostly a hairless breed. So how does that behavior correlate to the lab setting? In the wild, their natural food-seeking behavior is rooting. They dig holes to cool off in the mud. Anyone that has had pigs in a lab knows that they make the most noise of anything. They're ramming gates, they're lifting gates, anything that moves in their pen, they will try to manipulate just to figure out, or just to make noise. I've seen pigs grab the chains and just slam it along the side just so they can make noise and have something to do. The social order, when piglets are born, they immediately get aggressive towards each other and start to fight for teat dominance. And you see that in the lab setting as well. And as well as it's weaning or resorting, you get a lot of fighting amongst regrouped animals, which is a natural behavior. And the dominance can also be extended to human personnel if they interact with those as soon as they're resorted. So how do we harness these natural behaviors and try to better enhance the well-being of the animals and subsequently enhance the well-being of the animal care staff, the veterinarians? How do you develop that relationship? And that's the key to most behavior management, developing a relationship and maintaining a consistent relationship. And that's how you get progressive learning. And it doesn't matter what the species. And I find I'm struggling a little more with that every day with my toddler. So it's been a fun experience. So what you'll see sometimes in the laboratory with handlers is some headbutting. Usually most people mistake that as play. Sometimes it can be actually aggression. Sometimes more serious aggression or biting on the legs, toes, and hands. But a lot of times what I see is that the aggression is actually confused with irritation or boredom. If the animals aren't interacted with enough or have enough things to keep them out of trouble, they get irritated, or they have a jacket on that's not fitting right, or something's irritating them. It's not necessarily aggression. They're just trying to let you know that they've been at it long enough and something needs to change. Miniature pigs are also slightly more active than domestics. That's been proven over and over, especially in the production setting where they're all group housed. Miniature pigs rapidly acclimate to humans in a lab in less than 4 weeks, typically. Depending on the protocols, depending on how long acclimation is, there's a lot of factors that can influence that. But usually you can get them used to your interactions in the first 4 weeks, which we try and accelerate with a lot of our programs in the production setting. So just like teachers, we must first figure out how the students learn and how they retain information. And it's the same way with any species that you're working with, and what their motivations are for learning and how to change their behavior. Negative reinforcement works. Most of our program is based on positive reinforcement. As Dr. Shapiro said, that's mostly what we try to do in the lab setting anyway. There's always a negative stimulus attached to a learn response when there's negative reinforcement, and the positive leads to a learned behavior that they want to repeat over and over again. So building on those normal behaviors and trying to use that to our advantage, we try to teach pigs, or any species really, how to react in a laboratory environment by mimicking what they would normally do in the wild. This adaptation and the training becomes a coping mechanism, which leads to less stress. If anybody's ever worked with pigs, you know that the more stressed they are can affect any result in any of your projects. So it will affect white cell count, it'll affect cortisol levels. If you're trying to do ECGs on a stressed out animal, you're not going to get it done very good. Stressed pigs will yield scientific research data that's of little or no value, or it can be very skewed. So we try and use these scavenging and foraging behaviors, some of their sensory ecology. They have very keen sense of smell and hearing, and they use a lot of chemical communication, especially once they reach sexual maturity. The boars will chomp and release pheromones in their saliva, and they use that as a reproductive attractant, and they can also use it for defensive mechanisms. So abnormal behaviors that we have to prevent sometimes, or conflicts that you may have more aggressive males or more aggressive females. Sometimes we can do that through genetic selection. You can do that through the environment, or just by behavior management and changing the behavior itself through behavior modification. Like us, pigs are social animals. They show separation-related behaviors. They're very gregarious, which is why there's been a big push over the last few years, unless you have sound scientific justification to not socially house them, they should be. The process for acquiring knowledge and understanding comes from an inherent desire to survive. Since pigs are a prey species, they're always on the lookout and always in survival mode. So it's either going to be fight or flight. And you have to use that to your advantage and gain that trust when you're starting to do behavior modification, even in the field. You need to be aware of cues also that may be threatening to the animals. So you get a batch of new animals in, and your technicians go in and they jump up in the pen and stand up over top of them. That's going to be very threatening to them. I always try and tell technicians or new staff, or even when I'm training ours, to approach the animals at their level so they don't feel threatened. Don't make quick movements. A lot of the same guidelines you would follow with other laboratory species. And learn how to communicate with the pigs and have fun. And I think that's really a big part of what we try and push in different settings. Is it's got to be fun for the animal, but it also needs to be fun for the technicians, and they need to have a sense of satisfaction from the work that they're doing. So the learning theory with pigs, so we try to make sure that it's non-confrontational, positive reinforcement. The learning depends on the reinforcing properties. So it depends on the interaction, the situation, the environment. And we do this in a variety of different scenarios. Like I said, we start out doing certain things in production, but I have the ability here to find out exactly what the protocols are doing, or what procedures these animals are going to be going through. And we can start some of that training ahead of time, or it could be a novel procedure. A few months ago, we trained some pigs to voluntarily get on the treadmills and run, and it was pretty easy to do, and there was no negative stimulus required, which I've seen from several papers early on. So target training really does work in just about any scenario. There's the non-associative learning, which is habituation and flooding, and then the associative learning, which is what we try to do mostly. I know depending on the procedures, or if it's a short-term procedure and you just want to sling train an animal, or get them used to a process, loading them in a cart, whatever it may be, that habituation may work if it's going to be short-term, but over the long term, it's not going to be best for your staff and the animals. So with a good understanding of their species typical behavior, the staff and the animals can be readily trained to use positive reinforcement in their everyday life, from washing the pens to general husbandry to injections, just anything that you can think of or you need to have done. The training does take a little extra time, but researchers who have used trained pigs versus untrained pigs can tell you that the benefits are always going to be worth the time and investment. So behavior is the measure of the training process. And that's kind of what we use as our criteria. If the behavior changes from the naive animal to the trained animal, then we realize that learning has occurred. Misbehaviors are usually an expression of a survival or fitness or someone not following the protocol. And we found that labels such as friendly, nervous, shy, dominant, they don't really tell you what behavior is being expressed. It's more of a state that the animal is presenting. And I use these true false statements here that I actually got from some of our research technicians because they were having a problem with one of the pigs, and they kept saying, well, the pig is biting me, you know, in the boots and it's trying to assert its dominance, when in actuality the pig was scared, and they realized that as soon as they bite that person, they shut the front door and went away. So they didn't have that that fear stimulus there anymore. So again, the learning depends on the reinforcing properties and the consequences of the interaction or the environment. Abnormal behaviors are typically caused by unsafe, unaversive, inescapable, or unpredictable or uncontrollable situations. If the animal cannot predict the outcome, you're probably going to get some sort of fight or flight response. And recognizing abnormal or avoidance behaviors, like I said before, is just as important as learning to communicate and what the animals expect. Because if you have mixed signals, it can cause stress for everybody, not only your staff, but the animals, the veterinary staff, anybody. If an animal's trained to a certain procedure and they don't know that, and they go in and cause more stress, and then the original technician comes back and tries to reinforce that, you may have to start from square one because they've already had that negative event. So how do we prevent abnormal behavior? Like I said before, some of it we can do with selective breeding. Inside of our colony, we can kind of do just a quick scoring of like a 1 through 3 on how the animals approach you, what their temperament is. Also in the environment, a lot of socialization, habituation, handling, and then learning, which is what we really base all of our training around. Just like pet owners learn to manage, you know, maybe a skittish dog that they may be at risk of biting. With pigs, you learn to manage the risk that they're a prey species and they're going to want to get away from you. So you use that natural tendency to figure out what would be rewarding to them. So positive reinforcement obviously results in calm, pleasurable anticipation. You can teach the animals what to do. They overcome their fears and their phobias. It gives them motivation to learn a new behavior. A lot of times what I will see with negative reinforcement, even though it's unintentional, the animal will develop anxiety about something, such as pushing an animal away and saying no at the same time. Well, that animal then learns that that touch at the same time as that person saying no is going to be negative. So now they won't approach that animal. So you have to be very careful in how you develop the protocols or continue on the protocols and make sure that everyone is on the same page. Something else that we do quite frequently is try to come up with new ideas for environmental enrichment. Obviously, anybody that's worked with pigs knows that the chain is the everlasting pig toy. Not so good for dental studies though, but we found you can do several different variations. You can suspend frozen water bottles with fruit in them from the chain, nylon bite sticks, brushes for rubbing, foraging boxes. Their natural instincts to root and forage make it fun to come up with safe ways to provide environmental enrichment. And it's really a fun game for the technicians to come up with new ideas as well. There's a picture of the everlasting chew toy. So the grade school program is something that we've kind of started, and it's a stepwise program in production that I'm able to foster onto the CRO setting. So you have to have to have any successful program, you have to have dedicated staff who are self-motivated and want to improve the idea of how can I make everyone's life easier and better, and how is this going to improve the welfare? So to set up your pig and your staff for success, you start communicating with each other, and then every interaction, once they figure out what that is, becomes a learning opportunity for the technicians and the animal. Once they start working with an individual animal, they should have 1 to 2 sessions, 5 to 10 minutes each day. If you're trying to train for specific behavior, whether it's target training, whether it's trying to get them to load in a cart, whatever that may be. The program consists of 6 basic habits, 5 grade levels. So that's why we kind of called it the school program. But the overall goal is to overshadow the fear and anxiety, which leads to positive interactions and a learned behavior. So at the beginning, we start with physical contact, mat or tabletop training, targeting, stay in place, and then targeting with specific goals in mind, whether that's getting in a scale, going through the divider in a caged pen, it doesn't matter. Once the physical contact and approach are started, we start that from birth. So we start shortly after the piglets are born. And what that does is when the piglets notice that the sow is comfortable with interacting with humans, they're a lot easier to train from that day forward, because mom says it's okay, so why wouldn't they do it? So positive reinforcement should involve learning as opposed to luring. Luring quickly leads to attention-seeking behaviors that could be undesirable, and I've seen that a lot with, for instance, dermal studies where they're doing a dermal dose and they're trying to lure the pig to the front of the pen. Eventually, yes, you get the pig to the front of the pen, but he's gnawing on your scrubs or chewing on your hand, or he's not targeting a specific behavior that you've taught him. He knows that eventually, if he bugs you enough, you're going to give him a treat or something or go away. So you want to make sure it's not luring. So the first week, I'm going to kind of go through these weeks a little bit faster. We start hand feeding, short, frequent sessions. Anytime the piglets are paying attention, we reward them with food from their hand. If you don't get a response after 3 seconds, you just ignore the pig and go on to the next one. If you start to get an undesired behavior, you don't give that negative reinforcement. You either modify the approach or you just ignore it and come back later. Because a negative response is still a response. So they're going to take that either way. If you just ignore them, then eventually you'll get to that learned behavior. We start this as the platform in production so that the animals will, once they're ready to leave, they've already gone through some of these steps. But we modify this all along their lifespan, depending on different people's needs or questions I receive, or it can be modified at any given point. So at week 2, we start hand feeding, or we continue the hand feeding. You've already established that in week 1. We start using our hand as a target. That's something that obviously everyone has with them all the time. You don't have to use that clicker stick, and you can change gloves between litters, maintaining biosecurity, etc. So we repeat the normal exercises 3 to 5 times. If the first attempt is not successful, do not force it. Just go on and then come back the next time. Week 3, we introduce a mat into the litter. So that's when we start the mat training. You repeat the hand targeting exercise 1 to 2 times, and then you start to introduce the mat as the target instead of your hand, and then you foster that. Piglets pick up on it really quickly. So once targeting the mat comfortably, increase the time by a few seconds that they have to be on the mat before you reward them. This will encourage the learning and through the process of the sitting for the reward. So if they stay in place on the mat, you increase that time just a little bit. Sometimes you can push the limits. Sometimes if you push too far, they'll just get up and walk away. So what we call middle school, junior high, and beyond in our grade school, weeks 4 through 12. So you have the foundation has been laid. The last 4 weeks, you've shown the piglets who their human vending machines are. The basic targeting has been set. So you can pretty much, the sky's the limit now. You just have to maintain this with the individual animals. Communication is training. It has structure, it has mechanics that are and it's procedural. And that's a big key in learning. When in training, the end result is clear communication from the handler to the pig. And you want to make sure that that is carried on from everyone in the staff. Even if you have dedicated socialization team or dedicated people that are in charge of these programs, you want to make sure that no one's changing up the program just a little bit, in the middle of the day, because that can have a big impact on the overall learning. The next one, I just have a little video of, so part of our positive reinforcement, pigs really, one of the biggest things they like is really just to be scratched and loved on like a dog. So I worked with some of the research staff that were having to get the pigs in and out of the pens every day to trim, or not every day, but on timelines to trim hooves. And I said, you guys can probably just train them to do this in the pen. You just have to find the right reward and do it appropriately. So you can see he didn't lay there and obviously let you do all 4 feet at once, but he was more than happy to do it as long as you were giving him a back scratch and a belly rub. So, and that's the way we check the glucose on most of our diabetic models as well. All they want is a belly scratch. So they'll just walk up to the front of the pen for that, and you can do a simple ear prick and get their glucose, and then everything's over with. So we use that a lot as a reward. So the one thing that people have to be careful of is that cue response reward interactions can be negative and not even realized. So the staff should be mindful of their interactions and how they're perceived. Everyone has to know, including the animals, that good things happen together. So pigs that have not learned to control their instincts have not totally adapted to being domesticated or being in a lab setting. But even wild animals can learn to cope with their new environments. So every time you interact with your animals, make sure that you're doing it in a way that's proactive for everyone and that is going to further your protocols and enhance the behavior and make sure that learning has occurred. Motivation drives your technical staff as well as your animal with wanting to learn and figure out how to do new things. You can use vocal tones and body language to communicate. And then training tools, we use targets and clicker training, bait on treat pouches, a lot of things that you can give your staff to have them right on hand. long-term solutions, the targeting is about the best way that we've found to do for long-term studies, because there's so many different things that can be done. The target is the one constant in their life, so they know as long as you're using that something positive is going to happen. You can see different variations of, we have the animals sometimes walk down the hallways, load into the carts, load into scales. So the primary reinforcers are innate, obviously. Food, water, reproduction, these are all things that are instinctual to the animals. Secondary reinforcers depend on, you can use those, but it depends on how often it was paired with the primary reinforcer, such as the example I gave earlier, saying no when touching the animal. That's a negative response, and then your learned reaction is eventually going to be to avoid the person or to avoid being touched, because that person was saying no when trying to correct a bad behavior instead of just ignoring it. And after that, you'll start to see extinction of a learned behavior that someone else has been trying to teach. So communication is really key between all the staff members. Distraction is also a problem sometimes. It prevents expression of unwanted behaviors. To give them a simple task. So best examples of this are when you put an animal in a sling, or you have a long-term physical exam or something like that. You have to have something for the animals to be distracted. Otherwise, they're going to get bored. They get bored quickly. So while you're doing that, give them something to do. Give them a piece of rope to chew on, or someone else there giving them the belly scratch. Just some sort of positive reinforcement so they don't get that negative stimulus. It's important, as I said before, to reinforce good behaviors and not to reinforce bad behaviors. Anytime the pigs try to bite or mounce or show any other undesirable behavior, you just stop what you're doing, ignore them, move on to the next candidate, and then come back later. You don't ever want to push the training, because then it becomes negative. So in conclusion, targeting and behavior enhancement is a tool that everyone can use to replace unacceptable behavior and get animals to learn new behavior. It enables the staff and the animals to go through a stepwise program to learn new behavior and replace fear. It's fun for everyone. I love doing it. I love teaching people. And it's really good to see the response from staff members once you show them how to make their life easier. So I think the program empowers staff to use the animal's natural instincts to help them cooperate. And in that cooperation, they accomplish all their SOPs. You increase staff motivation and satisfaction, and it improves animal welfare. And I think that's it.
Great, thank you, Derek. Now we actually need to take a brief pause so that we can get the closed captioners switched.